Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we'll continue where we left off in lesson 19. Maybe recap very quickly. We said one of the main issues that led to the Mu'tazila not being able to reconcile with different ideas and the background that they're coming from in reaction to the Ash'ari was that when they looked at the human act, they saw that it could only have one cause. That cause is either the human being with his free will, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, going back to Tawheed al-Af'ali, so the monotheism in action. Because these are the only two possibilities that were seen by the scholars, by the people at that time, some of them said we are going to favor monotheism, that is the main principle. So let's sacrifice anything else to preserve the true monotheism. Those were the Ash'ari. And so they get rid of the free will. So the human act becomes a result of the ultimate cause, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His will and His act. The Mu'tazila said, no, the purpose of our existence is to either end up in hell or in heaven. For that to work logically, we need accountability, responsibility that stem from free will. So we are going to preserve free will and say that in the case of free will, the divine monotheism, the divine action has no intervention here. So the human being has absolute free will. So we said before we answer this question, before we give our interpretation, our understanding of this, based, as we said, on what we understand from Ahlul Bayt, is that let's take a moment to understand the different types of causality. And this is a topic we've talked about, but we wanted to make sure that we stop here for a second and give the different types of causality that we find in the world. So one type of causality, as we said, is simultaneous. So sometimes you do see an event and it is the result of multiple causes. That does happen. Okay, so that's one version. And we said, for instance, if we look at a tree or a plant growing, you're going to see multiple factors leading to that tree growing, developing. The second type is alternating. So you see in certain circumstances, you have one cause and another cause and another cause with a result, but those causes are not in action, they're not intervening, they're not causing all at the same time. So they alternate, the causality alternates. And then we look at a third type where we said it's an ordered causality. So for instance, if someone is following the instructions of their boss at work, their manager at work, they are doing the work, but the result, the act, we could say that it is because the cause is the person doing it, or ultimately the boss who ordered the act to be done. And we give multiple examples of that, including the hand that moves, the pen that writes on the paper. Okay, so this is an ordered type of causality. So we said, if we wanted to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's causality on the world, is it version 1 of causality, the first type, second type, third type? We said the third type is the closest we have to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's causality on the world, because it's definitely not the simultaneous. If we look at simultaneous causes in this world, we see that they are all partial. None of them are a ultimate full cause. If we look at the second one, that would imply that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's causality stops at certain times. So if we're looking at the human act, we're going to say that at times there is free will, and at times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will is the one that results in an act. So it cannot be that one. The third one is the ordered effect. Okay, but what's the difference? What's missing here? what we encounter in the world, we see that there are ordered causalities that does exist, but the causality is not the absolute type of causality we talked about, which not only causes an outcome, it causes the existence of the thing with all of its traits. So we do have that type of causality, but it's not full. It's not the complete one. So when the word is being written by the pen, that is being moved by my hand, that is being willed by my mind, that is an ordered causality. Okay, so this is where we start understanding the notion that we explained before. We refer to it as a vertical causality. There's a vertical chain. For the next cause to actually be able to cause, to have an effect, to make things move, to change, to effect, for that to work, there's a cause that gives it that power, that gives it that ability to cause. Okay, so that has to be clear. The causation is caused by something given to it by the previous cause. This part we maintain. This part we keep in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we have to add something that we find nowhere else, and that is in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's causality, He not only allows the power, the trait, the faculty, the ability to take place, He gives the entire existence to that being. So that being's entire existence has to be maintained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, including all its faculties, its ability to cause. In that sense, if we understand this type of causality, this fourth one, then if we go back now to the human act, keeping this type of causality in mind, we can see where the Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira fell short, because they thought that it's either or. It's either Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's causing, or the human being who's causing. But when we look at these types of causes, we see there are other types of causes. There are vertical causes. And in this case, we could see how me as a human being, I do have free will, I do act based on my free will. There's an effect that I'm causing based on my free will, but my free will and my entire existence has been given to me by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we maintain Tawheed al-Af'ali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we maintain His ultimate power, and we also maintain and preserve the free will of the human being, including the accountability that comes with it, so that in the afterlife we say it's all based on merit. It's all based on your action. Yeah.
So just for a refresher, I think when I had asked you last time about what Mu'tazila means by complete free will,
yeah,
you answered that they couldn't consider Allah like just a prime mover, and then you let us read. So they believe in there's Sharia, there's this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to do this or not this.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought it's talking. But in this, so we don't have free will into dictating what's halal and haram. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that.
Yes.
But He created us, and then from then on in, He's left us. So even if we do dua, it's good for us to do dua, but it doesn't mean He will not intervene.
No. Okay, so
He cannot intervene.
Do not generalize what I said to everything happening in the world. Only use it for the free will. Only the department of free will. When I act, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving me full power, full reign to apply my free will.
Okay.
We're saying that does not come. That free will is actually maintained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like my existence is.
Okay. But they say that when I'm acting on this free will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never intervene to stop me from going to a haram place.
Yeah, right.
Say sometimes I'm going to a haram place, Allah says, okay, he's a nice guy, let me pump his tire. They say this would not happen.
Right.
Allah would not interfere.
At a superficial, generalizing level, yes, they say that.
So this is what they mean in the sense we have complete free will.
Yes, yeah. And they lean more towards a delegation.
Yeah, he's delegated.
Exactly. Where we say He intervenes a lot more than that.
Yeah. We see it in the middle, not like other side where we do nothing.
Exactly, yes.
God might answer my dua, He might not.
And this is a And the details is the next lesson. So this one was the decree and destination. This is part of the destination. Okay, so this is the architecture of the world. This is every single event, the planning, so that for me to be prevented or not prevented from, let's say, committing the sin, that my tire pops, this is part of the general architecture of the world. See, so we resolve the issue by splitting the event into smaller causes, a chain of causes that is infinite, going back to the moment the world is created and everything having an effect on everything else. If this is what ends up happening, it's because it's been architectured in a certain sense, in a certain way. So all that to say, it is possible to preserve free will and to maintain the true meaning of Tawheed, because this is exactly what both other schools fell short of doing. Okay? So attributing human action to human free will, is it possible or not? Yes, it is possible. It's not contradictory with attributing it to divine will. The divine will is that I have free will, and He allows me to exercise it. Different types of attribution, as we said, this is an absolute type of causality in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He not only causes, He gives the entire existence as well as all the faculties that follow. So this is just another way of explaining that there's a vertical causality. It's a more fundamental causality. So if you look at the direct cause, I'm the direct cause of my action. But for this to be possible, it's maintained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the system of the world that He has created. So one way to understand it is to say that the human free will is actually the last piece in a chain. And that chain has been maintained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has been put in place by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is where I exercise my free will at the end. But even that part is part of the chain. So is there an autonomous effect to any other cause? Absolutely not. And this is how Tawheed is maintained, including me and my free will.
You know, say when you said that last part, so even this little bit of control that we have over our free will, it's so hard to preserve that through marketers and through social media and through conformity and social pressures. Even that can be so heavily diluted.
Of course.
Almost end up being a machine.
And this is all of your entire existence, and the purpose of your creation is to keep control of that and do with it as you're supposed to. Of course.
That little bit that you have.
The world is directed towards taking that, removing that away from you. Yeah.
So you have to be a rebel.
You have to be a rebel. Go against the grain. Okay, so nothing can ever be outside of the divine will. What about sins? We talked about sins. We'll mention it very quickly again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the will, the free will to do as we see fit, as we choose to do, which includes sinning. Does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to sin? Now we have to go back to the lessons where we explained the different attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we said in the case of, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have irada? Is He murid? Yes, He is murid. There are two types of will. There's a legislative will and there's an existential or ontological will. An existential will means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills something into existence. That type of will, be and it is. That's how the Quran refers to it. Kun fayakun. This is the existential will. Al-irada takwiniyya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it and it is. It's an existential, ontological will. And there's also, of a different type, a will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants something, and we're not going to explain it entirely again, it's just a reminder. There's the legislative will. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribes with a law. This is not a natural law. This is a legislative law. This is a tashri'i law. This is religion. This is when He says pray or don't pray. Allah is not willing you to pray existentially, otherwise you would have no choice but to pray. If He wills it existentially, it happens. Allah wills it legislatively. He tells you, I want you to pray, and existentially, I'm going to give you the free will to choose whether you pray or not. His will is that you exercise your free will. It's not that you do this or that. And that's why if the question is, so does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want people to sin? Well, we have to split it in the want is, does He want them to sin existentially or legislatively? He does not want anyone to sin legislatively. But He wants you to apply your free will. So if you choose to use it for a sinning, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to allow you to do. That's the existential will of Allah. He wants to see what you do with it. And if you choose it not to sin, He will also allow you to do that. And all of this can be extracted from a verse like when the Quran says, but you do not wish or you do not will unless it is willed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So some of the fruits of this belief, if we understand this belief properly, what does it give us? First of all, we said this is the best way to understand monotheism. This is an extension of our understanding of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is one, His act is one, He is the only real, ultimate, absolute cause of the world, including us, including our free will. And now we understand how that free will is still possible within a system where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate cause. Then there's also a part to this, the product or the byproduct of this belief. This was the more theological aspect. But there's also a very more practical, psychological, spiritual aspect. So understanding the decree itself, the topic of decree, al-qada, al-qadar, as the author says, it's supposed to give us a lot of resistance or resilience as we go in life. Someone who understands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has architectured the world in a certain way is going to interpret every event, everything they encounter in the world as being part of a much greater divine plan. If I really understand this, then I will have a lot more patience and a lot more ability and a lot more resilience, strength in going through the difficulties of life. If I actually believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I believe that He is the one who has created the world in this way. So what's the issue? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants me to go through a difficulty. I go through the difficulty. But if I say this is all random, if this is all by chance, and I have absolutely no control, and it all means nothing, it's without purpose, it's without finality, then my attitude towards these difficulties is going to be completely different. And so here we can extend it. I'm making the link to mental health and its importance nowadays. So this is a link to mental health. So one way is you are confronted with difficulties, you're facing tribulations, tests in life. One way to interpret it is by saying this is all within a greater system, within a greater plan, all in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I believe in Him, and I know that He's doing this for the right reasons, in His wisdom, whether I see it or not. That's one way to go through life. And the other one is to despair, to be stressed, to be anxious, and to feel that all of this is going to lead to nothing, and I'm just going through the difficulties and someone else is not, and why is this happening to me, and so on and so forth. So understanding, so one part of it, this is more the theological part, there's an understanding and a theory part. This is the order or the nature of this world. It's created in a certain way because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted this type of system to exist. And He wanted us to go through this type of world by exercising our freedom or free will within this type of system. The second part, and this is something that we can extract from some of the verses of the Quran, and I'll mention it in the next slide. And this is maybe something that we don't see right away. It takes a little bit of a deeper look, deeper insight, but the Quran makes it a lot easier for us because it makes it explicit. That you understand the relativity of this world. You're not tricked by this world. You see that not everything that is happening to you is all based on merit. It's not because you're good that you're entitled to everything good being in your life, or if you're bad, you're entitled to bad things being in your life. That's not how it is. Everything is a test. The good is a test and the bad is a test. The easy is a test, the difficult is a test. The point is to see what will you do with your free will in that test. Every moment, every day, every year, your entire life. That's the whole purpose. And one way to see it is don't be tricked by the beauty of this world and don't be tricked by the ugliness of this world. Both of them are tests. So, the point I'm adding here is maybe for us to reflect upon, because the more we understand this, the more you start seeing that this becomes one of the criteria to see the true level of faith of someone. For me to assess someone's faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belief in Allah, belief in the oneness of Allah, in all the senses that we've explained, this becomes our test. This is how I can assess people. Are they patient or not? Can they exercise their free will under pressure or not? Do they keep trust? And are they fully submitted in all of those conditions? And we'll get back to it in a second. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe you went over it last time, Sayid, but decree and destiny, what's the easiest way to understand the difference between either or?
Yeah, so al-qada and al-qadar. Okay. Decree is a judgment. It's the ultimate final result. It's one decision. I don't want to use the English word. Okay? That's qada. It's a decree. Yeah. And then there's the qadar. Qadar is the architecturing, the planning, all the phases, all the limitations, all the calculations that lead to that outcome. So there's taqdeer and qadar, and there is qada.
So destiny lead to decree?
Yes. And we called it predestination, but in short we can call it destiny. And decree is like a judgment, a decree by a judge or by a state or by... Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So the mistake here, and then we'll go into a few examples from the scriptures. The mistake to avoid. So we were entirely on one side because that's the problem we've encountered in Islamic theology, so we spent all of our time on that. The other extreme is to say, well, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has everything in His hands and He's the one who plans and He's the one who decrees, then why do I make any effort towards anything? And so this is the other extreme, not to fall into the other extreme and say, well, I have nothing to do. It's all in Allah's hands and I trust and rely and submit to Allah and whatever happens, happens. No. This is completely rejected in our religion. Although this is something that's making a comeback lately and living Zen completely and going back to the ancient Greeks who had these types of schools where they would say you have to live in a manner that is completely indifferent to the entire context you're in. It doesn't change you in any way and you do nothing and you just go through life. That's the highest level of wisdom that you can attain, is to be able to remain the same without doing anything. It's a passive existence. This is rejected by our religion. There is no passiveness in our religion. You're always active. Even when you don't do anything, this is an act. It's measured, calculated, intended. There's no passiveness. Our role is to act, is to read the context, to interpret what is desired of us in this set of circumstances and do something about it. So that's the other mistake, falling into passivity or laziness, accepting injustice, and this is what happened in Islamic history, as we said. So this started being twisted around to say you have to accept the context that you're in. Yeah, but this is a context of political injustice and oppression. You have to accept it. This is God's will, and your job as a good Muslim is to submit to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is where we have to make the linkages of, let's call it political awareness or understanding the reality of how the world works, so that religion is not used against us. Being degraded, so on and so forth, or refusing one's responsibility. A first verse, no affliction can happen on earth or in yourselves, but it is in a book before we bring it into existence. That is indeed easy for Allah, so that you may not grieve over what escapes you, nor exult, nor be happy over what is bestowed upon you. So this is the reason the world is the way it is. So that you do not become sad when things are removed from you, and you don't become too happy when things are given to you. That's the whole point. Allah does not like any swaggering braggart.
It's like this major Stoic philosophy where you are always
Exactly.
it's the
Yes.
exact same thing.
Exactly. Second one. No bearer shall bear another's burden, and that nothing belongs to the human except what he strives for. So this verse, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى. These verses are emphasizing this idea that, one, you have to act, because the only thing that you own is your act. You have nothing else that will be given to you except what you did, and then whatever you did will be given back to you. So I don't know what can be more just than that. If all that will be given back to you is whatever you did. And this requires lengthy discussions that we're not going to get into right now. But this is a different way of seeing punishment and reward than to say, I do A, I do an act, and I get heaven, I get B. These are two different entities. Whereas the Holy Quran says, whatever you do, that's what will be given back to you. So unless we interpret this in a metaphorical way, this forces us to understand the afterlife completely differently. You do A, and what we're going to give you back is A. And you do B, and we're going to give you back B. We're not going to give you back something different. Okay? And again, when the Quran says nothing belongs to the human except what he strives for, then that basically, if anyone wants to use the Quran, it's difficult not to read these verses and see what they're saying and still see that there is no free will, for instance. Right? This is 100% free will. The only thing you get is what you do, and we've given you full power to do it, and whatever you do, we're going to give it back to you in the afterlife. Another verse, Allah does not task any soul beyond its capacity, and we'll talk a little bit about this. That's the last verse of Surah Al-Baqarah. Whatever it earns, it's to its own benefit, and whatever it incurs, it's to its own harm. You do good, it's to yourself. You do bad, it's to yourself. Our Lord, do not condemn us if we forget or make mistakes. Our Lord, do not place upon us a burden as you placed upon those who were before us. Our Lord, sorry, there's a mistake there. Do not lay upon us what we have no strength to bear. Excuse us, forgive us, and have mercy on us. Until the end of the verse. This is going to be important for the next lesson too. So keep that verse in mind. And then we end with this. In the previous slide, because last week was the event of the passing away of Zainab alayhi salam, I wanted to make a quick link here. If you look at the slide before, we said at the very high level, it's not only that you start to understand and accept the difficulties of the world, there's actually a reversal. You start embracing the difficulties. You start seeing them for something that is desirable and enjoyable because you see that difficulty as being the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what you embrace. You understand that that is His will and that's what you want too. That's the meaning of submission. And that's why if we go back to the events of Karbala, so these are not normal difficulties and tribulations. In the most extreme way, we see someone like Zainab alayhi salam, when she's asked by Yazid, she says, when he says, how have you seen what Allah did to you or did to Hussein or to all of you? She says, I have seen nothing but beauty. So this is how we understand it. Okay. So let's move quickly to, we still have time, let's start the next lesson.
So can I ask a quick question?
Yeah,
I
go.
don't really that quick, but
Yeah.
you can answer every not even my question. Because you're stressing difficulties and the importance of difficulties when it comes to growth and accepting it and admitting to it. try to remove all difficulties from our children, and you see how that's obviously weakened them as they get older. I mean, most parents submit to this kind of parenting because they don't want to feel inadequate, you know. So I like the saying goes, before you prepare the child for the road, now we prepare the road for the child. It's completely different. So how would you advise someone to parent these days when everyone's removed like today you don't even need a nuclear weapon, you just need peanut butter and just all the soldiers would be gone. You know, everyone's allergic to peanut butter, can't lose, no one can hear no.
Mm-hmm.
They can have snowball. And
I'm gonna answer with one quick line.
So how would you,
this is completely out of topic, but I'm gonna answer. I'm gonna say one line that comes from Ibn Khaldun.
Yeah, okay.
In his Muqaddimah, you know, he's considered to be a historian and a sociologist. He's considered the father of sociology, modern sociology. He summarizes his study of history in this line. He says, difficult circumstances create very strong men. And very strong men create luxury and comfort. And luxury and comfort create weak men. And weak men creates difficulty and crisis. And the cycle goes on.
So you submit to having your son be weak?
He's basically saying this is the trend of history.
How do you do it?
Yeah, but if you submit to that, if you create easy, comfortable, luxurious conditions, expect weak men to follow.
Yeah.
And expect out of those weak men chaos and, you know, war and weakness.
So how do you avoid that in a time of ease and comfort? How do you not?
You have to be aware of it. You have to know, you have to understand. The child does not want a type of, I don't know, bitter medication. You say, I'm going to make it easy for them and not give them medication? Or are there times when you say, okay, there's a force feeding. Okay. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Okay, so lesson 20, the last lesson in the book, and this one is actually entitled Divine Justice. So in this lesson, the author spends a little bit of time explaining, he's going to bring together the topics, the issues, the questions that were addressed in lesson 19 and 18. And he's going to, so you'll see a little bit of repetition, but we're looking at it from a different angle. So he'll start by, after the introduction, to talk about the notion of justice and divine justice. What are the proofs? And then he'll give 4 objections that he considers to be the strongest objections that may be given against divine justice, and what are the answers to them. I think you'll notice that, and I think I said this 2 lessons ago, that this could have been presented differently. There are things that he skims over that I think should have been explained in a lot more detail, and the opposite. In this lesson, the one thing I would say is there's a lot of emphasis specifically on, you know, this is a dichotomy between Asha'ira and Mu'tazila, and so he's reacting to that very classic presentation of these issues. And I think in today's world, if someone doesn't want to study it from the angle of what has happened, what has transpired in Islamic history, and how is it studied as Islamic kalam, and more, these are the issues that people face nowadays, and the big scholars or the activists of atheism who use divine justice against belief in God, this is not where they're coming from in a lot of cases. You will see at the foundation, at the root, the issues are the same, but they're not presented in a very modern way. That said, it's still good, it's still very valid, but it could be rethought and polished that way. And this is a very long lesson, so I'll see what we can cover now. But in the book, if I remember correctly, usually lessons are about 4 to 5 pages. This lesson is about 9 pages. So it gives you an idea of so we could split it in 2, or we could see the lesson itself as 1 and the 4 objections as another lesson. If we go back in the history of, you know, the development, the theoretical knowledge development of Islam, we notice that at some point divine justice became a principal issue on its own. When in reality, divine justice, and we'll re-emphasize that in this lesson, divine justice should have been dealt with as an extension of Tawheed. If we're talking about the existence of Allah, which was not very big at that time, there was no need for it. The issue was not the existence of Allah. People spent a lot more time on the attributes of Allah. It should include the discussion about, is God just or not? It goes without saying, it's a logical ramification of that, logical conclusion. But what happened is that this topic became so contentious and people started falling into one school or the other because of this topic, that this topic was now the way to distinguish between people. So it was kind of promoted to the rank of the main tenets of Islam. You either believe in divine justice as the Mu'tazila do and the Shi'a do, and they were referred to as Adliyah or justicists, people who believe in justice, or you're not Adli, which were the Ash'ara. Does it mean that we actually had Muslims who said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just? Absolutely not. We have never had and will never have Muslims, someone who says I am Muslim and I believe in God, and who will say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just. The Quran is explicit, the riwayat are explicit about this. So what's the issue? So here's where we have to go back a little bit more into the theory. This is not explained that much in the book, but let's just take 2 minutes to do it. This is a very complex topic and the author mentions this again and again. We're not going to go into the details. Before we talk about how did the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ara end up where they did, we have to go to a root question. This question, the details of it, we can't get into right now. But we have to go to the question. The question is, when we look at an act, can we say that that act intrinsically, by its own nature, is good or bad or not?
Yes.
That's what the Mu'tazila answered. That's what the Adliya answered. The Ash'ara say no. They say there is no good in itself and there is no bad in itself. If something is good, it's because God either made it or ordered it. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not do something or prohibited from doing it, that is the bad. So lying is bad because Allah says do not lie. And stealing is bad because Allah says do not steal. So in itself, intrinsically, there's the first question. Is the good and bad intrinsic by the very nature of something or not? That's layer one. And that's a huge philosophical topic. So you have to go back to moral philosophy and to see the details of that. And even nowadays in moral philosophy, that's what they study. The nature of the good and the bad. Where does it come from? That's layer one. Layer two. Assuming that it is good or bad, is human reason equipped to recognize this is good and this is bad or not? So this is epistemic. This is at an epistemological or your ability to know level and not the thing in itself. So first of all, we have to establish that the thing in itself is good or bad, and two, that human reason is capable of discerning between good and bad by itself, on its own, aqli. As opposed to what? As opposed to aided by reason and scripture, religion and scripture, revelation. If you say, I need revelation to know if it's good or bad, you're saying reason is incapable on its own to reach it. And this is what led the Ash'ara to say that for this whole topic, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just or not? This is what they mean. They do not mean to say Allah is unjust. What they're saying is you cannot take your mind as a criteria, your human fallible reason as a criteria that you're going to impose and dictate on God what He should do and shouldn't do. You're not a real monotheist if you do that. Again, that's what they sacrifice. Everything else to preserve monotheism. If you say that your ability, your reason is capable of discerning good and bad, you're going to apply that to the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore you're imposing your reason on the divine act. So you can say at the end, Allah should do this and shouldn't do that. Allah should take the good people and put them in heaven, and should take the bad people. And who are you to tell God what to do? Whether it's in this world or the next. Ultimately, it boils down to this. So they say human reason is incapable, and the thing in itself does not have good or bad. If you look at an action by itself, it has no good or bad. So there is nothing for your reason to go discover. So do not try to impose that on Allah and His act. Okay? So the Mu'tazila came back to this and said, absolutely not. Human reason is capable of discerning good and bad are in the thing in itself. The very nature of things carries within it good and bad. And that's what we're going to see in a second. So when we say that that good and bad are intrinsic, al-husn wal-qubh al-dhati, or when we say that good and bad can be discerned by our reason, by our intellect, so al-husn wal-qubh al-aqli, these are two layers. Do we actually also mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is now going to be subjected to our reason, to human thought and human reasoning? Is that what it means? No, that's not what we mean at all. No one can say we're going to impose anything on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His act. What we're saying is when we look at the divine act, so we have to flip the equation, when we look at the divine act or a potential hypothetical divine act, we have to say, is it compatible with reason or not? Is it compatible with the good or not? And in that way, it's not that I'm imposing, it's that I discover. My reason allows me, unveils, reveals to me the truth of the thing. I'm not imposing anything on the divine act. These are two completely different ways of seeing it. So we'll explain that now. And here, this is the first time the author says, this is a very complex topic. Generally speaking, the Shia side with the Mu'tazila, and that's why they were referred to as Adliya. Does it mean that we agree with them on all the details? Absolutely not. But we're not going to get into the details in this lesson. So we can generally agree that we are Adliya, and we are against those who are not Adliya or who try to refute the Adliya. So the lesson is structured as explaining the notion of justice, proofs for justice, and or different meanings of what the just is, and then answers to objections. Yeah.
It just seems kind of like we add a layer that the Ash'arites skip. Like, okay, we believe in a good act is intrinsically good because God made it so. They just seem to skip over that.
They don't need it. Yeah.
Sorry?
They don't need it.
Yeah, the Ash'arites just skip it.
Yeah. To preserve.
It seems like we're saying the same thing then. It's just we add a layer.
Which is
that God makes the act intrinsically good. See, we think the act is intrinsically good.
Yeah.
And why is it intrinsic? Well, we think because God has made us to intrinsically believe in a good act is a good act.
Yes, if you see it that way, then yeah, you can say we're adding a layer. But there's a very fundamental difference between us and them. They say there is no good or bad.
Yeah.
We only call it good because God told us this is good, and we only call it bad because God said that it's bad.
Yeah.
We say we actually recognize. A human being, even without religion, recognizes.
Yeah.
And this is what we're going to
His
say.
reasoning and his rationale, which they
Reason,
But it
yes.
just seems like there's an extra
Yes.
layer that we add that they just skip over.
Yeah.
To help us understand.
It's a very, very simplistic, monolithic belief, the Ash'ara. A few verses. Say, my Lord has only forbidden indecencies. So I can keep going, the outward among them and the inward ones, and sin and undue aggression, and that you should not ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala partners. Okay, that part. My Lord has only forbidden indecencies. Do we understand from this that there are things that are indecent and Allah has forbidden them, or did they become indecent because Allah has forbidden them? There are things that are indecent. Human beings should recognize that those things are indecent, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden them. Another verse. Indeed, Allah commands justice and kindness and generosity towards relatives, and He forbids indecency, wrong, and aggression.
They exist.
So those things exist in themselves or not? And are we able to recognize them as human beings or not? This is what the Quran says. قُلْ أَمَرَ رَبِّي بِالْقِسْطِ, for instance. What's qist? What's justice? What's the just that the God is asking us to do? Do I have to wait for the scripture to tell me every detail of it? Or is it implying that I'm able to recognize it by myself on my own? And I'm supposed to know that being generous towards relatives is a good thing. And the Quran is basically saying, and it recognizes and it agrees with you, keep doing that good, that is good, keep doing it. It's universal. Another verse, when they commit an indecency, they say we found our fathers practicing it. And Allah has commanded it upon us. Say, indeed, Allah does not command indecencies. Do you attribute to Allah what you do not know? Another verse, when you have understood this, this is not a verse. This is from the letter of Imam Ali alayhi salam to his son, most likely Imam AlHasany alayhi salam. When you have understood this, so he explains, he talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then he says, when you have understood this, then you should do that which is done by someone like you in insignificance. And he goes on until he says, for indeed, He does not command you except virtue, and He does not prohibit you except from evil. Okay, so this is an example from the narrations. So what do we mean by divine justice? And the reason we said this is because in the previous slide, and the author doesn't do this, so I'm adding the references. The author says, as you can see, I think it's... okay, so he says this is a complex topic, and generally speaking, the Shia agree with the Mu'tazila that about divine justice, as it is supported by the scriptures and the Holy Book and the narrations. And then he moves on, but he doesn't give any examples. So here are some examples of how it is supported. Okay, and then he goes on to say, but we don't agree with them in every detail, which is absolutely true. So what do we mean by justice? What do we mean by justice? Linguistically in Arabic, the word, generally speaking, means equality. Okay, adl is equality. Things are equal. In the terminology of ilm al-kalam, it's used, there are many definitions, we're summarizing, can be used in two big ways. Either it means, when I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just or divine justice, either I mean that an entity, whatever entity is, has certain rights, and being just is not transgressing those rights or giving that entity what it is due. Okay? What I'm supposed to give it based on those intrinsic rights that it has. Every entity, let's say human being, has fundamental rights. Being just is giving those rights to that entity. Okay? That's one way. The second way to understand, this is a very restricted, in a very restricted sense, what we mean by justice. It's the more specific meaning. The more general meaning is to say that I give everything whatever I'm supposed to give it. I give it the value that I'm supposed to give it. I give it the place and the weight that I'm supposed to give it. And if I don't, I'm not being just towards it. So it's no longer just a matter of rights. It's more larger, more general than just rights. I'm going to add something that the author does not make any mention of, and this is not an advanced course, so we're not going to get into that topic. Just for something to keep in mind, and if you're interested in this topic. The notion that every entity has rights can become very problematic if you're in an advanced class in theology. Because can an entity that is a pure creature, pure result of a divine will, can it have a right on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It can't. If you create something in your mind right now, does that entity that you created have any right over you? It can dictate what you're going to do with it? It can't. What gives it that right? You make it come into existence, you do with it whatever you please, and you make it cease to exist if you so decide. This is the kind of causality we said that we have with regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's difficult to come back and say, and yet the entities of the world have a right, and divine justice means that Allah recognizes that right and acts in accordance with those rights. Okay, so we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to say these are the two big terms, and we're going to combine them together, because the second one, the second meaning of divine justice here, is basically what we said when we talked about divine wisdom. We say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise. In what sense? And that He puts everything where it's supposed to be. He gives it everything it needs for the greater purpose. You can't look at every entity individually. You have to look at every entity and how it fits into the big picture, how it's connected to everything else in time, in space, in order, in causality, in every way. So when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just, what we're saying is Allah must also give that entity whatever it needs based on where He put it in the system of existence. Yeah.
This one. So justice, you said, is understood also as equality.
Yeah, linguistically.
Linguistically.
Yeah.
So how does equality differ from equity?
Equality as an equal. One is equal to one.
And equity, what would that?
It's supposed to be more flexible.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be that you adapt. But I didn't want to use that terminology.
Okay.
So you're going to adapt. If one person needs more, and this is what the whole notion of equity, to be treated equitably, does not necessarily mean you're treated equally. Right?
Right.
I may accommodate.
I get 5, but I need 5. He doesn't need 5.
Yeah, so that's equal treatment.
Yeah.
You're in an exam and he has a special accommodation and he needs an hour and the exam's 30 minutes and I give him the hour.
Okay.
To give him the same chance you have. I change the conditions for him. That's more equitable.
That's equity.
Yeah.
So wouldn't just
So this is,
equity
yeah,
rather than equality?
exactly. That's what we mean. That's where we're going.
Okay.
But the linguistic meaning, that's why I said if you want to use the etymology of the word, adl equals adl. Something is yu'adil. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
So it's an equal sign. So that's why we're saying we're not using the term in its linguistic sense. It's not what the dictionary says. Okay? We're in the terminology of theology, the two big meanings are either you say it's about the rights. So you have rights, he has rights, I have rights. Am I being treated based on those rights or not? If I am, then God is just. If God is not treating me based on my intrinsic rights, then God is not just. So now I have to determine what those rights are.
Okay.
And we're saying this is a little bit problematic as a notion, but this would be left for a more advanced course. The other meaning is, let's look at it from the angle of wisdom. And this is what the author does. And he says, let's simply say that the best way to understand divine justice is to say it is synonymous to divine wisdom. So we have to go back to lesson 11 where we talk about divine wisdom as one of the attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise. What do we mean? We mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for every entity that is created in the system, it has been dealt with in a manner that is perfectly appropriate for it within that whole system. For it to perform what it's supposed to perform in the big picture. That's what we mean by divine justice. So this is our issue. Is God just in this sense or not? And this solves a lot of questions, as we'll see. Okay, just this understanding of divine justice. Okay, so as we said, if we want to properly study this topic, we would have to go back to moral philosophy and philosophy of law. So if we look at the example of someone who, you're there and you see someone sees an orphan, powerless child eating a piece of bread, and someone comes and steals that piece of bread from the child and goes away. Or if you see someone come and kill someone who is innocent. Any human being who looks at this, would they say that this is a wrong act, or would they not be sure? So the author says everybody would agree. This is an injustice that was committed. This is wrong. This is bad. So these simple examples show us that there is good and bad in the things themselves, one, and two, that we're able to recognize it. It doesn't mean we're going to be able to recognize it in everybody is going to be able to recognize it in every circumstance. But it means that we have the capacity to say there is good and bad, and we have the capacity to determine that ourselves as human beings with reason. Whether I believe in God or not, that should not affect my ability to recognize that. Which tells us what? Which tells us that it's not legislated by religion. It is the good and bad in themselves are not legislated by religion. They're universal capacities and they're intrinsic in the thing in itself, in the act in itself. And then the next question becomes, where does this ability come from? And he says, again, outside the scope of this course, we're not getting into that, but obviously we all know that our religion says this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put within us, our ability to recognize good and evil. Surah Al-Shams talks about this. Okay, and a last quick remark, justice in the sense of wisdom cannot be equal to between one thing and another. So I give every entity the same thing. This is not justice, and this is how we live our lives as human beings. We don't treat everybody the same for good reason. If I see an act, I don't assess that act in the same way if I see it done by an animal versus a child or a minor or a grown-up or the king of a country. Right? Every one of these entities, people or animals, I'm dealing with it on its own. This is the equity we talked about. I'm dealing with it in the manner that is appropriate to it. So we can't go back to saying it's all equal. It's not all equal. So he gives the examples of a teacher with the students in his class, if they're studious or not, or the judge, if you have two people coming to you disputing over money, no one would say that the best way for the judge to deal with this, if both of them are saying this is my money, the judge to split the money in two and give to each an equal amount. This is not justice. The justice is to see who should get that money because it belongs to them and we give it to them. That's justice. Or for instance, if we look at law today, if I go in the law and look at how if a crime is committed, if it's committed by a minor, it's not dealt with in the same way as if it's committed by someone who is not a minor. Okay. So if we take now all of this and apply it to the universe, why are things not created equally? Why are things not created based on divine justice, in the sense that divine justice would mean everybody gets equal treatment, every entity gets equal treatment? The short answer is that, as we said, everything that has been created in a big picture. It's not created in a vacuum. It's created within a bigger system. Every entity in that creation, in that system, is created in that manner to optimize, to maximize the ultimate good towards a purpose. This is all not random. This is all supposed to be meaning something. It's intended, that creation is intended for a purpose. The purpose is to test your free will so that we see what happens to you in the afterlife. If we keep that in mind, then we assess what every entity is supposed to get in a completely different way. Then if I look at the world and there is no afterlife and every entity is its own self, not connected to anything else, and I say, why has every entity not been given the same equal chance? Because you're not looking at the big picture. If you start looking at the big picture, you see that every entity is fitting in a much bigger plan, and what you're responsible for is only the part that you've been given as free will. What you have control over. What you don't have control over, that's not your responsibility. So the link between free will, accountability, and ability. So this basically, this system, now we're talking about the system of creation, is linking us back to the topic of free will and divine decree and predestination. This is how we see when, for instance, the Holy Quran says Allah does not task any soul beyond its capacity. So this is one level of divine justice. It's true that the circumstances change, but the assessment that is made of how I interact with those circumstances also changes. There's a recognition that the circumstances change, therefore my accountability changes. Which means there is justice. Everything is being adjusted. If the circumstances allow me to do something, then I'm expected to do it. If the circumstances don't allow me, then I'm not expected to do it. And the reward and the punishment and will follow. And of course, for all of this to work, you have to look at the big picture. I always come back to this. And the big picture includes the afterlife. The big picture does not stop at death. If you stop at death, none of this works. Because you're not including the purpose. You're not including the full system. The full system doesn't stop at the moment of death. If you look only at this world, yeah, it's full of injustice. But if you look at the whole thing, no, everything will be readjusted. There will be a compensation that will take place that will give back to each what they deserve. That will right all wrongs. Were any soul that has done wrong to possess whatever is on earth, it would surely offer it for ransom. This is in the afterlife. People wish they had everything they could to pay it as a ransom so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't punish them for those deeds. They will hide the remorse when they will see the punishment, and judgment will be made with them with justice, and they will not be wronged. Again, so the idea is, going back to what we said before, what you're given is what you put in. And the wronging means that it depends on the circumstances. Allah is promising, is making a commitment that maybe your circumstances were different, but in the moment of judgment, that will be taken into consideration. An injustice is not going to be made against you because your circumstances were more difficult than someone else. It's all part of the equation. Nothing is lost. And finally, today no soul will be wronged in the least, nor will you be requited except for what you used to do. So again, comes back to the outcome, the result, heaven, punishment, reward, however you look at it, is equal to what you have put in. But that deserves a huge topic on its own, because it's not just equal, it's equal plus the divine generosity. Okay? It's equal plus. But for now we're talking about justice, so we have to establish this part first. And all of this, as I said, it's much better understood when you see that it's in reaction to. So we have to make this work for us, for the world we live in, for the issues that we hear. How can I believe in God when there is so much evil in the world? My circumstances or someone's circumstances are much more difficult than someone else. This applies. These are the right answers. But the way the lesson is drafted and expressed, the statements are made, it's as though it's in reaction to what the Ash'ara believe, right? So this is all countering what the Ash'ara believe, which is divine justice is a moot point. We don't need to talk about it because God does whatever He wants. He has ultimate free will, ultimate power. If He decides to take all the good people and throw them in hell, that's fine. And that is just, and that is the good because God did it. And who am I to say God should do this and should not do that? And so that's why there's an emphasis here from the Holy Quran. We're going back to the Quran to say here are basically the counter arguments to what the Ash'ara are claiming. Okay, so we'll stop here. Inshallah, we'll continue in the next lesson. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.